Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Emma Morton, and I'd like to welcome you all to our 16th CREST-BD talkBD event on managing mental health and bipolar disorder. I'm joined today by a guest speaker, Dr. Greg Murray, one of the CREST-BD network leads, a clinical psychologist, and a researcher specializing in the relationship between the body clock and mood. And I always learn a lot from Greg when I hear him talk, so I'm very excited to have him here today. We're also joined by Victoria Maxwell, who has been with CREST-BD since its inception and is a renowned mental health educator and creative, and it's always a pleasure to hear her offer advice from a place of warmth and compassion. We have quite a few new viewers joining us today, so welcome all, and we're really glad to have you here. In case you don't know about this event or you haven't been before, talkBD is a series of webinars run by CREST-BD, a Canada-based network of academics, clinicians, and people with lived experience dedicated to improving knowledge about bipolar disorder, particularly building people's quality of life, minimizing stigma, and empowering people with the information and tools that can help them stay well. We started this series back in March 2020 as a way to provide some extra support and practical tips for coping with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has obviously run a lot longer than any of us were expecting or hoping for at the time. But it's been a really positive way, I think, for everyone in the CREST network to give back and share knowledge worldwide, as we're showing today with our guests from Canada and Australia. Today, we're going to be talking about a part of life that has been changed for most people during the past year and a bit, and that is our daily routines. In one of our earliest talkBD events, Greg spoke about the importance of maintaining good regular sleep for people with bipolar disorder. And while that's a key part of our daily routines, there are also other aspects of our life, how we work, socialize, and spend our leisure time that have been disrupted. For some people, there may be a positive change to routine as we start to open back up. However, change, even if it's for a good reason, can still present challenges if it requires us to adapt our behavior. And for other people, the changes as we move in and out of various types of restrictions have been quite disruptive, and you may be experiencing some difficulties adapting to that. So hopefully we'll learn a bit more about why that's important and get some tips about how to cope and adapt. Before we begin, I'd like to do some quick introductions, starting with myself. I'm a researcher at the University of British Columbia studying digital health tools and quality of life in mood disorders, and Greg was my PhD supervisor when I lived in Australia, and he actually introduced me to Erin and the CREST-BD team, which has obviously worked out really well for me. And here at CREST-BD, we like to practice what we preach when it comes to work-life balance. So in the spirit of that, I'll be asking our guests to share one non-work thing that they do that brings them some kind of positivity or self-care. For me, it's an important part of my daily routine is spending time with my dog, Winston, who is an ex-racing greyhound, and is actually a pretty good external reminder for me to keep a routine when I forget. Something about his brain has an unerring ability to tell when it's 5 o'clock and time for a walk. So I had to get that out of the way before our talk today. And I also try to schedule time in advance for hobbies, which lately for me has been cooking Japanese food that I see in this TV show called Midnight Diner. So I'll pass the mic to Greg to introduce himself. We'd love to hear about what you do for work, what you do with your involvement with CREST, and one thing you do to relax in your downtime.
Thanks, Emma. And just to remind you, Emma, you are not Canadian. You are coming back to Australia. This is just a temporary sojourn to Canada. Yeah, I've been involved with CREST right from the start. Erin Mahalik is a great mate of mine and a very important colleague in my work life. I don't know what year that we connected up, but it was a long time ago. And so I've been involved with CREST. And just like an hour ago, a friend of mine's daughter was recently diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and she contacted me for sort of advice. And I realised again how important CREST-BD is in how it talks about bipolar disorder. So, of course, this young woman has, been moved into medication and dealing with psychiatrists and in a very sort of medical view of what bipolar disorder is. And I'm really relieved when I can direct people to CREST-BD and the materials and the wellness centre, which really just has a much warmer and more humanistic focus on bipolar disorder. And obviously Victoria, who I love talking to and is part of today's talk, she's on those videos we made for the wellness centre, and it's just a really positive and constructive way of thinking about bipolar disorder. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of CREST-BD. In my work, I do a whole bunch of research into psychological treatments for bipolar disorder, and also this stuff we're talking about today, one of my favourite topics. I have been a clinical psychologist for a long time, specialising in bipolar disorder, and I now do a whole lot of supervision of PhD students, some of which are almost as good as Emma, around topics to do with bipolar disorder. And one thing I do for a hobby, well, in fact, my main hobby is I play the drums, and I was a professional drummer until I was about 40, and now I still get to play gigs, but my day job is where the most of the money comes from, which is actually where literally my interest in today's topic came from. I tend to think about the world in terms of rhythms. That's my most fundamental lived experience of the world, is the importance of pulse. It's actually a metaphor and a bodily experience that means a huge amount to me. So during lockdown, I've been able to actually at lunchtimes practice, and you'll all be excited to hear that I can now play a samba at 110 beats per minute.
Wow. Very cool. And you also enjoy working in music-related puns into your article titles wherever possible.
Of course, of course.
Thanks, Greg. Victoria, it's so wonderful again to have you here.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here, and I always love co-presenting with Greg. It's always fun. Yeah, I've been involved with CREST since its inception, and I knew Erin prior to that. I was actually a participant in one of her very early studies, and then it sort of segued into being part of it, CREST, as a peer researcher. In my other life, I'm also a mental health speaker. I live with bipolar disorder and psychosis, and I have some contracts with some local health authorities as well. What I do for fun outside of work, I guess it's a couple of things. It's really being outside. I mean, sometimes I run, sometimes I walk. The most helpful is actually being by the beach for me. And in terms of rhythm, I think some of it has to do with the waves, the tide going in and out, and somehow giving me a bigger perspective, and recognizing that my issues that I may be experiencing usually will pass as the tide goes in and out. So that's one of the things. And then cooking, I've just recently changed to being a vegetarian, and so I've really enjoyed starting to look at vegetarian dishes, and Buddha bowls are my favorite right now because they're so easy to make. Yeah, and they're really creative. So those are two things I can say. So thanks, I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks, Victoria. And also, not on camera, but behind the scenes helping us, Caden and Laura, who are helping monitor the chat and a Facebook page and making sure that the gremlins don't shut down the Zoom or anything terrible like that. In terms of housekeeping, just before we kick off, we have a lot of people joining us today by a couple of different platforms. We have people who are watching us live via Zoom and on our Facebook page. If you have questions, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box. You can comment on the Facebook live stream. You can also put in comments anonymously via the CREST-BD talkBD page. And after we get through the main presentation, we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. But for now, I will hand it over to Greg and Victoria to talk more about routine.
Okay, do you want me to start it off, Victoria?
Yeah, I think that would be great. That would be perfect.
Fantastic. So I was thinking, where should I start this story? and I actually did have some slides, but Erin told me I wasn't allowed to use them. So I just follow instruction. So every treatment guideline in the world for bipolar disorder has a little sentence in there somewhere that says something like, encourage people with bipolar disorder to maintain daily routines. And that idea has been around for just about, forever, that people have been thinking about bipolar disorder beyond the medication part of the treatment that's so important. So from a behavioural perspective, the idea that there's something about routine that is really useful for bipolar disorder is just sitting there, recognised by every professional in the world. And I in my experience as a clinician, I also noticed that in most of the people I work with bipolar disorder, they say the same thing. They tend to say, my life goes better when there's structure in it. And my life, the real low points in my life have been when there's a lack of structure. So people say, I was pretty good while I was at school, and then things really fell apart, or, uni wasn't so good for me because there wasn't enough structure. One of the things that went wrong when I broke up with my partner was some of the routines and daily rhythms that I had in the relationship were lost, and that was actually a loss for me. So from both those perspectives, it seems pretty clear that there's something about daily routines. And with Victoria later, we'll chat about some tips about, what that actually looks like. But what I want to spend a couple of minutes talking to you about now is really one of my favourite lectures to give. And I'll try and make it a little mini lecture. And it's about why routines might be important. And it's about the biology of routines. So we will get to why keeping routines is important, but really it does help, I think, to understand why routines are important. And the story starts here. Every organism on the planet, including human beings, evolution has designed us to fit with the environment, right? That's what evolution does. It tries to make dogs like Emma's dog and me and everyone else and everything else, including flowers and everything else. It's designed every organism to optimally fit with its environment. And normally when we think about the environment, we get an image in our heads about, if you've studied psychology, you go back to caveman days and you think about saber-toothed tigers and threats in the environment, all those sort of things that are important. But one thing that is overlooked often when we think about what is the environment that species are adapted to on Earth, one thing we overlook is the environment is in fact dramatically rhythmic. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, think of your environment at the moment at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then think of that environment at 3 o'clock in the morning. They couldn't be more different. The cycle between light and dark is so dramatic that nature has worked out, and nature worked this out millions of years ago, that the change from light to dark is so important that we can't just react to it, we have to predict it. And we have a predictive, every species, not just me and Emma's dog, but every species has a predictive mechanism built into us. It's a clock. We have a built-in biological clock that ticks away inside us, wakes us up every morning, starts to wake us up from about 3 o'clock in the morning and on a countdown sort of process, and prepares us for darkness that is coming every day. And it prepares us for sleep by releasing melatonin, which is a sleep-inducing hormone. And it performs this function because nature has worked out, like for human beings, for example, we're adapted to function well in daylight. We really need to know when it's going to be dark again, because all of a sudden, all our functioning is very, very different once it's dark. And similarly, given that we sleep as a way of recuperating, nature needs to wake us up. And it's quite complicated waking up an organism like a person. So we have this clock. It's called the circadian system. Circa is Latin for about, and dies, day. So there's a rhythm that pulses away inside all of us at about 24, it's an approximately 24-hour rhythm. And it keeps going even if you put people completely out of contact with any time cues, right? So it's not being pulled by light and dark or alarm clocks or anything else. It's actually coming from inside. And specifically in human beings, the clock sits about 8 centimeters in there, deep in the base of the brain. Well, what some Asian religions call the third eye, in about there. And it pulses away and tells us when to wake up and when to be active and when to go to sleep. And so that makes perfect sense, I reckon, right? The idea that this clock is there. But there's one more step before we get to the notion of routines. Why would routines matter? A really interesting feature of this clock, and one of the things that I personally find most appealing about it, because it's a biological process, it's genetically grounded. The same genes that drive my clock are the genes that get Winston, Emma's dog, to know when it's 5 o'clock. It's exactly the same mechanism. And it's the same mechanism that's in plants, like the mushrooms that Victoria and Erin were talking about before this call. Every organism has the same clock mechanism, and it's a genetic mechanism that's well understood. And so when we talk about genes and biology, we start to think, oh, you mean like hardwired. This is just some part of the brain that's deep there and it just keeps ticking away irrespective of what's going on in the environment. No, it is a genuine clock, but like a clock, you know, an old-fashioned clock, I don't know if anyone's got them anymore, where you can, you know, adjust the hands on the clock. The clock in the brain is the same as that, and it gets adjusted every day because the sun comes up at a different time every day across the seasonal year. So the clock needs to be open to the environment. It gets adjusted or synchronized every day. So it's open. So it's a real clock, but it's open to a daily adjustment. Now, that's what makes routines important, because the circadian clock actually responds to how we act. The main thing it's sensitive to is light. So at the moment, I'm sitting about a meter away from a window, and at that distance, I'm not actually getting enough light for my clock to notice. But if I move to about 10 centimeters away from that window, my clock notices. And so it registers that it has seen daylight at this particular time. So you're starting to guess what I'm about to say here. The clock benefits from receiving reliable timing information. And we do that by behaving in routine or regular ways each day. So it's a really fascinating thing, as I reckon, that the behavior, how we act on a daily basis, can either support the clock or disrupt it, right? So lifestyles where we're going to bed at 3 o'clock one morning and then 10 o'clock at night the next day, very irregular lifestyles, they confuse the clock. And there's one, and so I hope you get that. And there's one final bit in the story. This clock is closely linked to parts of the body and the brain and the mind that are about mood. One of the things the clock drives, for example, is daily patterns in energy and mood. And so you think, oh, okay, if that clock's not functioning well, we might start to generate not just problems with the clock, but problems with our mood. And so for about 20 years, one of the most important biological hypotheses of bipolar disorder is that there's a vulnerability in the clock. So I've just told you a story about how this clock is how it works and how it's important in mood. But the final part of the story is that people with bipolar disorder may already have a bit of a vulnerability in their clock. And so the importance of supporting the clock is probably more important for people with bipolar disorder than it is for people without bipolar disorder. Supporting the clock is really important for everybody. So reliable timing information coming into the clock, it comes in through the eyes, the light information. It's important for everybody. That's just part of human biology and health and well-being. But for people with bipolar disorder, we think they may already have a bit of a less robust clock than people without bipolar disorder. Mm. So that's why routines are particularly important for people with bipolar disorder.
And before we jump into tips about how to establish that routine, maybe Victoria, is there anything that you'd like to speak to about how that body clock works for you?
Yeah, it's been really interesting listening to sort of the where and whys of it all. And because I think of it in terms of bipolar disorder in particular, that when I'm in an episode, my routine goes completely upside down or sideways, goes pear-shaped. And that starts with sleep. So in terms of light, dark, gets all mucked up. It can do with eating, social contact, all the different kinds of things. And my mood is already being affected, and my mood affects my behavior, which affects my routine. My routine affects my circadian rhythm, which creates this negative feedback loop. And so I won't go too much into the strategies and things, but I notice how vital it is to do those kinds of regular, and it's I recognize there's also structure, but there's also routine time to actual like a schedule. So there's one thing to say I'm a morning person and I get up somewhere between 7 and 10 in the morning. There's another, even though I might like to have that flexibility, where I need to be getting up between 7 and 7:15. And that's sort of my wiggle room. I notice also that it affects anxiety. And I know we're talking specifically about bipolar disorder, but there's such a, it's so common that a majority of people with bipolar disorder experience anxiety. And right now I'm going through one of these anxious sort of phases. So I know my routine is even more important. And it makes it a little bit more difficult at times, but I have sort of basic ones. And so I find it really quite encouraging in some ways, because biology is on our side in terms of if we're able to get support to create those routines, then I know eventually I'll start to sort of become in harmony with that, and my mood should harmonize eventually. So yeah, it's fascinating. I love it.
Beautiful. I love how you described that, Victoria. I love your description of sort of the unproductive feedback loop between rhythms and mood and sleep, and that's absolutely what the science says. It's the feedback loop that can be the problem, especially in episodes. And I also love your idea of just slowly nudging things back on track. It's not as if, things are completely broken and then we need to sort of smash it back into place.
No, and a lot of times it's really about having support and not expecting it to turn overnight, because I noticed that it's almost like dawn, right? Where all of a sudden dawn starts to open up and then that change starts to happen. So yeah.
Yeah, that gentleness in anything that we do for our well-being, I think is a great perspective to take. So should we start to talk about a couple of the sort of strategies that people have noticed?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. So the core idea of what we mean by routines, as Victoria just said, is something about the behaviours we do every day, trying to make, as much as possible, aim to have them occurring at about the same time each day. So what are the behaviours we do each day? We've already mentioned getting up, going to bed, but Victoria also mentioned eating and socialising, and the other one I don't know if you mentioned this, Victoria, but we've spoken about it before, is exercise, especially if the exercise is being done outside in daylight, right? So there's 3 or 4 behaviours that, as part of our normal lives, we all do, hopefully we all do some exercise every day of some kind. But we all eat, and hopefully we all have some sort of social interaction, and hopefully we all get out of bed at some time each day. And so the aim is to make those things happen at about the same time each day. Victoria also raised an additional idea that is another body clock idea, which is a really important one. I've been talking as if we're all the same and we all just need these daily routines, and that's true. But Victoria raised an additional idea that we differ on when this, the optimal timing would be for these things. So Victoria described herself as a morning person, and that means that her activities, her preferred schedule of activities sort of starts a bit earlier than some other people. A lot of people with bipolar disorder are actually not morning types, they're more evening types, so they prefer to get up later and prefer to go to bed later. So that's what we call the phase, like when are you going to make this routine fit? It still needs to be regular across days, but what sort of time these things happen, there are individual differences in that. And you will know yourself, you will know when you've got free time and you can set your own schedule, what is your preferred get up time? What is your preferred bedtime? It's a really important thing to know about yourself as a person, that what we call chronotype. Are you a morning person or an evening person or somewhere in between? Because sometimes if we're trying to lead a lifestyle that doesn't fit with our chronotype, it's a real problem. If you're strongly evening type and you've just taken a job that means you have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, it probably won't work. You probably won't be able to maintain it. It won't be sustainable because it's just pushing too hard against your natural tendency. But yeah, so I really appreciate Victoria adding that extra nuance to the story. But so work out where you are in your day, where your energies come and go, and then start to try and maintain this stability of timing of daily activities across days, 7 days a week. And this is one of the other interesting things, of course, in the Western world, we've got this 5+2 approach to the week, the working week. And actually, of course, that's not how biology is. Biology is every day is the same. And you've probably noticed this in young people, your teenagers, there's a real problem where we see them, the school timetable doesn't work with their daily rhythms. And then they have catch-up sleeps on the weekend. And so you get this really weird sort of tension between their activities during the school week and their activities on their the weekend. And that mismatch is not very good for stability. So everyone needs to set up these things across 7 days. Look, the research suggests that for people with bipolar disorder, the daily activity that might be most important in sort of anchoring these routines across days is the time of getting up. That seems to be the one, and obviously, logically, a lot of things flow from that, don't they? A lot of other behaviours flow from that. But that seems to be the one that has the most muscle for supporting rhythmicity and supporting the clock, the time we get up. So if there's one key takeaway from today's message that I'd like everyone to sort of embrace, is have a think about what is a sustainable time of day for you to get up 7 days a week, and see what happens when you aim to stick to that, not rigidly, but as Victoria was saying, with generosity.
Yeah, and self-compassion. Yeah, absolutely. That kind of flexibility and warmth. Before we get stuck into answering questions, I'll just ask Victoria, is there any kind of key takeaways that you'd want people to have on how you manage to have that daily routine?
Yeah, well, some of it is actually just getting kicked in the butt too many times when I don't have one, right? And I wish it was something easier, but that's actually one of the reasons why I try to keep it. And I was thinking about this recently. There's a commercial, a chocolate commercial actually, and it says, get out of your routine and have, a little bite of chocolate. It was at work or something. And, because there's this idea that routine equals boredom. And I guess in some ways what I'd like is to reframe it, that at least for people with bipolar disorder, that routine equals freedom. Because for me, when I have a routine, I feel comforted. So if I'm having a bad day, I've got these checkpoints in my day. So as silly as it might sound, so I get up at the same time, I turn on the radio to listen to CBC News. I hear a familiar voice. If I'm alone, I catch up on whatever's happening in the world. I feel connected to the world. And then I have these checkpoints of, I usually have lunch at a certain time. I go out and get some fresh air, usually very early in the morning for a walk, but then at lunchtime as well. And what it does is it allows me then to not be as dependent on other coping mechanisms for my mood. And technically, it usually frees me up from these really extreme mood cycles. So instead of being really boring, because I'm not trying to be rigid around it, it gives me an ability to really be flexible in my life, and still have, time for socializing. And I still can go to that party and go to bed late once in a while and all that kind of stuff. I just can't do it on a regular basis to create otherwise it creates havoc. So I think that is reframing routine as we think of saying, oh, it's a really boring routine. It's like, yeah, but it really, really creates a lot of freedom.
Yeah, I love that.
That's a great way to put it, Victoria. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the CREST-BD kind of navigating the waves. We've heard from sometimes people that the anchor can seem a little bit like it's weighing down, but you're kind of putting it in terms of this is it gives you the freedom to explore and navigate those.
And it gives me the freedom then to be able to do other things that I really like, that give me enjoyment, that allow me to have fun, to do the kind of cooking or the writing or the having people over for dinner and stuff like that. So, yeah.
And I'm certain that there's a lot more tips that we could talk about. And I think they're probably going to come up in some of the questions that will be asked. So I might move into those now. The first one that we have actually ties in quite closely to Victoria, what you've just been speaking about. So it might be interesting to hear Greg's thoughts and whether you've got any additional ideas for this person. I get really bored trying to stick to routines, even though my psychiatrist says I should. How can I get the motivation to have a good routine? Maybe Greg, if you want to give your thoughts on that one first.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think, firstly, Victoria gave a great way of thinking about this. I think about these routines as kind of the foundation that enables you to be the best person you can be, to give you that freedom. And obviously, as a drummer, right, I've got the best metaphor of all time here, right? So the drummer's job is to set up that regular routine, but that means the front line, the show-offs, the singers and the saxophone players are free to create. And if the drummer's rhythm is unreliable, the front line just can't do anything. So I don't think the routine is the end. It's a means to the end of being, energetic when you're with your friends, of being ready to sleep when it's the time of day when you want to sleep, right? So it's not an end in itself. And especially for people with bipolar disorder who tend to have sort of creative tendencies, I think it's really important to underline that. We're not saying go from being, creative and enthusiastic to some sort of, railway line of black and white linear living. It's just that if you lay down that solid rhythm underneath everything, then your personality and your choices and your preferences and your, ability to engage with other people, that works better just because you've laid it down. So that's the way I think about it. But in terms of motivations to start to give that a try, I do think to some extent, I'd be interested in Victoria's thoughts. I think you kind of just have to give it a try. I suppose that's what I'm saying is, it's like exercise or anything else that maybe is a bit new to you. You know, everyone says it's good for you, but it's a bit of a pain in the butt to do. Kind of, you just have to give it a go and see what happens. And I would strongly encourage people who, yeah, hopefully today kind of inspires people to give it a go and see what happens. And then learn about what elements of the routine are, you know, tedious for you. I'd be interested for the person who asked this question, what aspect do they find most challenging or most unappealing? Is it the routine of getting up at the same time, roughly? Is it the routine of going to bed at the same time? And the devil's in the detail a bit about that. Like on a given night, you might want to stay up a bit later because there's a good movie on, or you're having a good chat to friends, whatever. So yeah, you can do that. But as Victoria said, just make sure the average is pretty reliable. So I'd be curious to hear a bit more about what makes it difficult. Yeah, the devil's in the detail there.
Yeah, and I really concur with you, Greg, around really tracking the benefits. Like if you like to say, give yourself 30 days to try the routine and set it up for success so that you maybe have 2 points that you're trying to routinize. I don't know if that routinize, I don't know if that's a verb. And see if you find that there's any benefit, because I think it's really only through your direct experience that you're going to find whether or not whether it'll be sustainable. And then within that, let's say you set up that 30 days where you're going to say, okay, I'm going to try to get up at the same time every day. And I find it particularly difficult, you know, obviously if I'm feeling depressed, but even on regular days, it's hard. And so some of the things that I've set up have been finding enjoyable things that I will do when I get up. So listening to CBC radio is one of them, the morning show. The other ideas is really create accountability buddies. And I don't necessarily mean accountability, but just buddies that you know you can text to say, hey, I got up, and celebrate your win, to give you some of the sort of, you can steal some of their motivation and their inspiration and their encouragement. And I think that's really important to create a social event. And the other is really that power of opposite action that comes from, I think, dialectical behavioral therapy, where I wake up often in the morning, even though I'm a morning person, and my comforter is so cozy and I don't want to get up, and I just do as Nike says and I just do it. And it's that opposite action. And as soon as I do, it's sort of like it creates momentum that allows me to sort of forget the other part where I was really wanting to stay in bed, and the ruminating that often happens when I stay in bed. So those are sort of the two things. And with all of that comes with self-compassion too, that knowing that it's going to be bumpy for a while as you set it up. But those are probably the two things, is setting it up for fun, something fun when you do, a friend that you can text or connect with, or something to say you did it, and then being able to do that power of opposite action and really celebrate that.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on that one, Victoria. I think as winter approaches for us, I might have to follow your advice. I'm dreading the return of the cold weather. And Greg, for your thoughts on keeping that kind of backbone or scaffolding through your day with the routine, because this really is an area that, you know, kind of seems easier said than done when we talk about translating that, you know, have a routine to the practicalities of day-to-day life. And on that topic, our next question is asking about the consistency of that daily routine. So are routines only meaningful if done daily? For example, if I only exercise on Tuesday and Friday mornings, isn't that disrupting the consistency of a daily routine? Or if I sleep in on Saturday, is that bad for me overall? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the most powerful behaviours we're talking about in terms of maintaining this robustness of our internal clock and the benefits for mood and energy that we get from that, the most powerful behaviours are ones that happen each day. So the exercise twice a week is not so important. So just because it's not giving information to the body clock as powerfully as something you do 7 days a week. However, the sleeping in on Saturday morning, that is not so good because we do wake up every day, and that is a bit confusing for the body clock. So yeah, I'd be a little bit more interested in working with you on why the Saturday morning sleep in is so important, and why if we could explore winding that back a bit. Whereas if something's not happening every day, then that's less of an issue. But if you are exercising it, particularly outdoors, I mean, what a wonderful thing is exercise outdoors, right? So if you do it with someone else, it's incredible, right? If you can do it twice a week, I'd be also curious about talking to you about how many more days could you possibly put it in. Yeah, what do you think about that, Victoria?
Well, and I was curious, I mean, one of the things, and I'm not sure if this is how it would fit in. So I have a really similar thing where I don't have, I mean, there's days where I want to meditate, there's days where I have time to do my half-hour run. But what I try to do every day is go outside after I've gotten up, I get dressed, and I go outside. So I either go for a run or I go and walk around the block. So I may not be doing the same activity or effort level, but I'm still doing a physical activity. So I don't know if that would still be considered, you know, it's not the same activity, but it's still exercise that gets me outside around the same time every day. So I'm not sure about, I'd like to hear what you say, Greg, around that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely best practice.
Yeah.
Because what we're talking about here, you know, it's actually the light exposure that's the strongest cue for the body clock. Exercise itself is a cue, eating is a cue, and social interaction is a cue. But the strongest cue for the body clock, the timing information, is the light. So what you're doing is absolutely best practice for building circadian resilience. It doesn't matter that one day you're, you know, working up a sweat and the other day you're not.
Yeah.
It's the fact that you are actually putting yourself outdoors in daylight. Daylight, that's the other little trick I don't know if everyone knows. Our eyes adjust to lighting conditions really, really strongly. So to our, you know, to our perception, indoor light is sort of as bright as outdoor light, but that's because our eyes have made an adjustment. Outdoor light is much brighter than on any ordinary indoor lighting. And so we get tricked a bit. So getting out, as you're saying, just getting out the door, makes a huge difference. Even on overcast days, there's actually a huge amount of light outside for most of us, even quite early in the morning on overcast days. In the middle of winter, as Emma was saying, in Vancouver, in you know, northern places like that, we may need a light box to help us with this sort of activity. And I know a lot of
and that's one of the things that I usually move when I go because of the light difference. And I also feel like it's a stacking activity. So even though I'm not working up a sweat, but I'm moving, you know, going for a walk, it somehow gives that sense of routine. So it may not quite be the same kind of exercise 7 days a week, but it's sort of that moving of the body that is familiar, and that familiarization seems to stabilize the mood, my mood anyway.
And it's also a behaviour you can do, which is for your own health, right? So it's kind of empowering to start the day with something that you understand is useful for you, and at other times you've experienced it as being beneficial. So it's a nice message to yourself that this is something in my control. If I can get myself up and put on the tracksuit pants and get out the door, I have done something for myself. Yeah.
Another positive way to bring that motivation in.
Yeah.
Our next question is about preparing for disruptions to routines. So this person has noted that I've become so afraid of relapse that I haven't traveled out of my time zone for over 10 years. So are there ways that people can plan for significant disruptions to their daily routine like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so as part of social rhythm therapy that some of you may have heard of, which is one of the evidence-based psychological treatments for bipolar disorder. There's two components. One is building resilience of your rhythm, which is mainly what we've been talking about so far. And the other part is preparing for destabilization. And so this is a really wise question. So obviously time zone travel is actually a significant challenge to the body clock. The nature was never designed to hop in a plane and fly 1,000 kilometers against the sun. So planning is really important. There's a couple of, and again, the devil's in the detail, but there's a couple of important sort of principles about this. One is literally working out what is the new time zone and what is the tension between my lifestyle at the new time zone and my lifestyle at the old time zone. And the principles are similar to the ones you will have heard spoken about with dealing with jet lag. And the core principle there is get on the local time zone as quickly as possible, right? So move your clock. You know, it's the same idea we were talking about before with morningness, but it's more of a state thing than a personality thing. The same idea, the clock's at a certain phase or orientation. The new city you're in is at a different orientation. And as with jet lag, the trick is to get on the local time zone as soon as possible. And that involves exposure to bright light in the morning, because that's what the clock is on the lookout for primarily. When the clock is trying to work out what time of day is it, it's light exposure in the morning that is the main information it's interested in. So as with jet lag, we say, get up, even if you've had not enough sleep on that first night, get up and start getting that light exposure in your eyes. And you might want to also, depending on whether you've phase advanced or phase delayed, depending on which direction you're traveling, you may also want to use melatonin in the evening, which has exactly the same clock effect as light in the morning. It's a cue for when darkness is at that new location. Now, I just mentioned something which is a bit tricky for people with bipolar disorder. I said, don't worry if you miss out on sleep. Now, of course, for people with bipolar disorder, missing out on too much sleep can be unproductive. So we might need to just moderate that a bit. So someone without a mood problem, we would just say, don't worry about losing sleep on the first couple of nights, just get yourself on the local routine. Someone with bipolar disorder, we might say, no, we can't really say that because missing out on a big chunk of sleep is not going to be good for you. So we might have to slow that process a bit about making the adjustment to the local time zone. So yeah, it's a really good question. Thinking through what is the tension between the new time zone and my current rhythm? The aim being to get onto that time zone as quickly as you can, but keeping in mind that if that involves a big loss of sleep, we might need to do that a bit more slowly.
Mm-hmm. It's been a while, obviously, Victoria, since we've travelled, but any tips for time zone adjustments?
Yeah, I mean, I used to travel a lot when I was keynote speaking, and I mean, I didn't travel internationally that often, but I'd go from West Coast to East Coast often. And a lot of it had to do with working with it like jet lag. And exercising was also a big one, and making sure that I ate. And one of the hardest things too, and I still find it difficult, is that if I come in fairly late, my tendency is to unwind for a couple of hours, get used to my space and all that stuff. But if it's 11 o'clock at night and my bedtime is 10 o'clock, I really just need to get in and go to sleep. So it's quite challenging for sure. The biggest thing for me is making sure that I adhere to sort of adopting the same time zone hours and regulating my sleep around that. And then if I can, getting out and getting some light in the morning. So really echoing what Greg said.
And hopefully those are all tips that we'll be able to put in practice not too much longer, fingers crossed. We have not a heap of time left on the clock, so I will perhaps ask one final question before we move into resources. So this person is asking, I think touching on what you said earlier, Greg, about, don't worry if you kind of can't get on the routine immediately. Can you please tell me some ways to cope with rumination and refrain some unhelpful thoughts? So on those nights when we just can't get to sleep, how do you stop the brain from worrying, especially when we know how bad, how impactful that disruption can be, especially for somebody with bipolar disorder?
Yeah, really good question. And I'll be very interested in Victoria's thoughts about this as well. But some of the things that I've found important over the years working with people with bipolar disorder is it's really important not to panic. And in particular on this issue, it's really important to realise that it's not one night's sleep that matters. It's the long game that matters. It's like exercise and diet, right? You can eat KFC. Do you have KFC? Kentucky Fried Chicken? You can eat KFC occasionally, but if you eat KFC every day, it's very, very, very bad for you. And the same for exercise. You don't have to exercise every day, but if you have a routine of exercising, it's very good for you. Same with vegetables, So these things are about the long game. So I am not concerned if one of, my clients with bipolar disorder says, I didn't sleep well last night. They didn't sleep well last night. That happens. It doesn't mean that, your world's falling apart or you're sliding into another mood episode. So yeah, people like me, you often hear people like me saying, sleep's really important, routine's really important. But the last thing that I'd want people to feel is under pressure to actually sleep well every night, have the routines in place every day. And that's not what I mean. For most of us, our system's pretty resilient. We can miss a day here, something can go wrong there. We may have worries on our mind, which are very difficult to shift, worries about other things. And so we do go through phases of sleeping less well, having some insomnia. It's important not to overstate how much of a challenge that is. One of the key take-homes today is, as Victoria said right at the start, it's the long, slow, generous, compassionate management of yourself that matters most, not the in the moment, right now, get it right, I've got to go to sleep. That way of thinking is not good for anybody, and it's definitely not good for people with bipolar disorder to put more pressure on yourself at a time when things are not going that well, like at 2 o'clock in the morning when you'd prefer to be asleep. That is a moment when things are really not going that well for you. That's not a pleasant state for people, anyone. It's not good to put more pressure on yourself by saying, but Greg said it's really important to go to sleep and it's really important. No, that's not what we're saying today. It's the long-term pattern of routines, maintaining them. We've used the word sustainable a number of times. Routines that are sustainable. That's what matters. So that's my tip. Rumination is hard to get rid of, but there's a little way of thinking that maybe takes some of the sting out of some of those thoughts. Victoria?
So perhaps on the drumming, if you miss one note, maybe people won't notice. Keep playing.
That's right. Yeah. And I'll sort of add onto it, but also deal with it as if, in that moment. And so I think that idea of lessening the pressure. So obviously, the more that you feel like you need to sleep, or the more worried I am about my rumination, the more I end up ruminating, which of course then just feeds on itself. So the things that I find that really help is that approach of just softening. So, and there's sort of a lot of techniques. So there can be progressive relaxation, all that stuff, but still, if I have the expectation that I hope to get to sleep, oftentimes it works in the opposite way. So one of the easiest things that I do is just really allow myself to be present with what's happening and use mindfulness. And so Tara Brach, has a meditation teacher, has a really great technique called RAIN, which is about recognize, accept, investigate, and nurture. And it's really just a way of being able to recognize your thoughts, accept them, and just be curious about them, and then nurture, like, what is it that you need? And it's really an approach of self-compassion. And so in some ways it takes it away from needing to feel like you have to go to sleep, or needing that you have to think a certain way or get rid of the thoughts. It's about allowing them to be where they are, and then bringing as much gentleness. And ironically, because there's that gentleness brought to it, there's almost a bit of relief that often occurs at the same time. And you may find yourself more relaxed, and you might be able to fall asleep, and you may not. And so that's sort of the approach that I often take. And you can Google her, and she's got free meditations, and it's a really helpful approach sometimes.
Thank you, Victoria. And Laura has actually dropped some of the resources that you were just talking about in the chat. And I'm really glad that we could end up touching on self-compassion and flexibility as we wrap up our question and answer section, because as with all of the topics that we talk about with CREST-BD, we never want that advice about self-management to come across as a maxim about how you should live your life. You know, we're all human, things happen, life happens, and it's important to be able to ride the wave of that with self-compassion and flexibility, and know that, like Greg says, it's about the long game. Because of the amount of time that we have left, I'd like to thank our speakers for presenting today. It's really wonderful, as always, to hear Greg speak and Victoria. I think we could probably run this for another half hour to get through all the questions. We had so many people joining us today, and I do apologize if we didn't have time to get to your particular question. This is actually the most people that we've had joining us, I think, for a talkBD event. But we do have a lot of webinars in the bank. So Greg has spoken with us previously on sleep and bipolar disorder. So if you had a question that was really specific to sleep, chances are it might come up in his earlier talk on that issue. So you can view all of these at the talkBD website. And we also have a lot of resources in the toolkit that Laura has just shared in the chat. And if you're watching via Facebook, that will also be shared in the link afterwards. As part of that resource toolkit, we're also sharing one of Greg's papers about the importance of daily routines and some of the research that his group has done during COVID and the impact of those disruptions to routine. I'm not sure if he's got a translation for that comic anywhere, but I kind of get the point. The body clock is important. We also have linked in that resource document one of Victoria's blogs on the CREST-BD website about ways to get good sleep. And we also have our most recent blog post is a really moving topic on that topic of self-compassion and self-acceptance from Louise Dweryhouse, and I would really recommend giving that one a read. Our Bipolar Wellness Center has a lot of resources to do with sleep, exercise, motivation, and daily routines. So we recommend having a look at that if you had a question that perhaps wasn't answered in this talk. Chances are we've got some information there that's relevant. If you're curious about how you're doing, whether it's in sleep or generally, our quality of life tool allows you to check in with yourself about how you're feeling across these different domains and maybe identify some areas that you could do with some extra support. You can also visit our CREST-BD website to learn about what we're doing, what kind of research that we're looking at now, and you can sign up to our newsletter for information about new studies or future talkBD events. Our next talkBD event is on October the 7th, right in time for the return to school in North America, which was still weird for me to wrap my head around as an Australian. And that will be with Stephen Barnes, who's one of the CREST-BD network leads. And he will be talking about practical tips for studying when you are a person living with mental health issues or bipolar disorder. After that, we will have, I think, an event that a lot of people have been waiting for with Dr. Josh Woolley, who will be talking about psychedelics and bipolar disorder and some of the research that his team has been doing about the potential impacts of that. And that will be on November 26th. So pop by talkbd.live. You can view our previous events there, submit questions for upcoming events, or also give suggestions about topics you'd like to see covered. And we also have them all on our YouTube page. We also would love to hear your feedback on how this event went, any suggestions for future topics or things that you'd like to see us cover. And that's really useful for us as a team to learn what we're doing well and what we could do a little bit better. We'd also like to thank our funders and partners, and we will show you on the next slide all the places across social media that you can keep in touch with CRESBD. So for now, thank you again to Victoria and Greg and Laura and Caden for the behind the scenes help. And thank you so much for everyone who came along. We hope you took something positive away from this event, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks so much for coming. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.